72 years old. That is how old I was the night my son looked me in the eye, held the front door open, and said nothing. He did not have to say anything. The cold air from outside rushed in and said it for him. I am Walter Eugene Briggs. I spent 40 years building things with these two hands. Houses, a family, a life. And on a Tuesday night in January, in the middle of the worst ice storm Memphis had seen in 11 years, my son Marcus let his wife speak for both of them. And what she said was enough to change everything. Welcome to Daddy's Revenge. Pour yourself something warm, get settled in, and understand this right now. The people in these stories always had a choice. They just made the wrong one. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me. You are going to want to hear how this ends. The cold that night was the kind that does not just sit on your skin. It goes inside you. It finds the old aches. My right shoulder, the one I tore working a roof job back in '91, tightened up the second I stepped off that porch. I had my gray jacket on, the one my daughter Patricia gave me for Christmas 3 years back before she moved to Portland. It was not built for weather like this. Nothing that night was built for what was happening. Let me go back about 45 minutes, because if you jump straight to the part where I'm standing on a Memphis sidewalk in January with a duffel bag in my pride, you will miss the part that matters most. My name in this story is not the victim. My name in this story is the ending nobody saw coming. I had been living with Marcus and his wife Renee for 14 months. It started after my knee replacement surgery. The doctor said I needed supervised recovery. Marcus offered the spare room. I said yes because he asked me twice and because the spare room had a good window that caught the morning sun. Renee had not exactly asked me. She had smiled and nodded in that way. Some people smile and nod when they're already building the argument for why something is not going to work. I had seen that smile before. I ignored it the first time. I should not have ignored it the second time. For 14 months, I watched that woman rearrange the house around me, like I was a piece of furniture she had inherited and could not donate yet. My coffee mug moved from the cabinet to a shelf, so, I needed a step stool. The television remote started living in a drawer she said was for miscellaneous items. My mail got stacked on the floor near the back door instead of on the table like everyone else's. None of it was an accident. All of it was a message. The message was, "You do not belong here." I read the message every morning and said nothing because Marcus seemed happy and I did not come into that house to cause problems. But problems have a way of finding you anyway. The night it all broke open started with a phone call. I was in my room reading a large print book about the history of the Mississippi Delta because I am a man of specific interests when I heard Renee's voice shift. Not loud, controlled loud. The kind of voice a person uses when they want to make a point, but also maintain the ability to deny they made it later. I was not trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. But the walls in that house were not built for privacy. They were built for a family that did not have secrets, and this was not that kind of family anymore. She said his name like it was a question she already knew the answer to. Marcus. Then she said mine like it was the answer to a different question entirely. Your father. Long pause. Has been here for over a year. He is fine. His knee is healed. The doctors cleared him 4 months ago. Marcus, we talked about this. Another pause, longer this time. I cannot keep doing this. That word. Cannot. The way she stretched it out. Like she was explaining something to a child who was being deliberately slow. I set my book down. I was not a child. I was not slow. And I had been cleared by my doctor for 4 months while living quietly in that spare room because Marcus said, "Take your time, Dad. Take all the time you need." I should have known whose time it actually was. She kept going. She had clearly been saving this. I heard her mention money. The grocery bill. The electric bill. The fact that I took long showers. The fact that I watched the morning news at a volume she found inconsiderate. The fact that I once suggested that their youngest boy needed more vegetables in his diet and less of whatever beige processed thing she was calling dinner. I said that once. One time. Apparently. Once was enough to make it onto the list. Then she said the word that moved me from my chair. Facility. Just like that. Flat. Practical. Like she had been looking at brochures. Like she had already made some calls. A facility. For me. Walter Eugene Briggs, who built the deck on that house with his own tools, who paid Marcus's college tuition without a loan, who held that boy while he cried the night his first serious girlfriend left him and never once mentioned it again, because some things between fathers and sons are sealed. A facility. I put on my jacket. Slowly. I did not rush. I was not running from anything. I walked down the hall into the living room, where Marcus was sitting on the couch and Renee was standing near the kitchen doorway with her arms folded across her chest like she was the last line of defense in a war nobody had declared yet. They both looked at me. I looked at Renee first. I said, "I'm going to save you the rest of that conversation." She did not flinch. She had prepared for this. Marcus started to stand up. I held up one hand. Not angry. Just done. I told them both, I heard enough. I'm going to give you exactly what you want. I will leave tonight. Marcus said, "Dad, wait." But he said it soft. He said it the way people say things when they want to feel like they tried. I told him I had not missed a payment in my life, and I was not about to start missing the signs now. That was when Renee said it. She said, "Good. The sooner the better. We cannot keep carrying a burden that refuses to carry itself." I want you to remember she said that. I certainly did. I went back to the spare room with the good morning window, and I picked up the bag I kept ready near the closet. Old habit. A man in my line of work learned early that some situations resolve themselves better if you are already packed when they do. I walked back through the house, past the family photos on the wall that still included me, past the kitchen where Renee had gone very quiet, past Marcus who was still sitting on that couch like a man waiting for someone to tell him which way to move. I said goodbye to neither of them. The front door closed behind me like a period at the end of a sentence that had been waiting a long time to be finished. The ice on the driveway caught me on the third step. Not enough to take me down completely, but enough. My right hand found the iron railing Marcus and I installed together the summer before my surgery. Cold metal. Solid. I stood there a moment, breathing. Memphis in January after an ice storm is one of the most honestly ugly things I have ever seen. Everything that looks soft in the summer, the trees, the lawns, the edges of things, goes hard and gray. There's nowhere to hide what a thing actually is. I thought that was appropriate. I walked to the end of the driveway and stopped. The street was quiet. One streetlight was doing its best 3 houses down. Here is what I want you to understand about being 72 that most people do not figure out until they get close to it. The hardest part is not the body wearing down. The hardest part is realizing that the people you spent your whole life protecting sometimes grow up and protect the wrong things. I stood on that sidewalk with my duffel bag and my bad shoulder and 14 months of small indignities sitting on my chest, and I made a decision. I was not going to call Marcus back. I was not going to make this easier for anyone. I pulled out my phone and called the one number that had not changed in 26 years. I called Dolores. Dolores Webb. 26 years as a paralegal at the firm of Henderson and Cross on Poplar Avenue. She had been my late wife Gloria's best friend since the 3rd grade. She had sat in the front row at Gloria's funeral. She had sat in the second row at my retirement dinner because she said, "Walter, the front row is for family, and I'm more than family, so I refused to be categorized that way," and sat 1 row back out of principle. Dolores picked up on the first ring. She always picked up on the first ring after 8 in the evening because she said that was when the Rayall calls came in. Walter. She said my name the way Gloria used to say it when she already knew something was wrong. I said. "I am on the sidewalk outside Marcus's house." Brief pause. "How much did you bring with you?" I looked at my duffel bag. "Enough for a week." "Good," she said. "I will be there in 12 minutes. She arrived in 9. A woman who drove a white Buick like she was personally offended by speed limits. She pulled up, looked at me through the windshield for exactly 2 seconds, then reached across and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in, Walter." The heat inside that car was the first good thing that had happened to me all night. She did not ask me what happened. She had been waiting for this call for 14 months, and she knew it. "Where do you want to go first?" she said. I thought about that. The obvious answer was her house. The second obvious answer was a hotel. But I had a third answer, and it was the one that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the moment Renee said the word facility. "Take me to the warehouse on Summer Avenue," I said. Dolores looked at me sideways. "Tonight?" "Tonight," I said. She drove. One of the things I respected most about Dolores Webb was that she could drive through an ice storm in silence, and make the silence feel like company. She turned onto Summer Avenue, and I watched the old neighborhood roll past. There are parts of Memphis that the city forgets about until someone reminds it. Summer Avenue, near the edge of Berkeley, was one of those places. Not dangerous, not abandoned, just overlooked. 22 years ago, I started buying overlooked. I bought a building at a tax sale for $19,000. Then another one, then a lot, then a corner. I was quiet about it the way I'm quiet about most things that matter. My accountant knew. My attorney knew. Dolores knew because Dolores knew everything. Marcus did not know because Marcus had Renee, and Renee had opinions about how my money should be understood. The warehouse on Summer Avenue was not a warehouse anymore. Had not been for 6 years. It was a community workshop. Tools, training tables, certification classes for young people who needed a trade and did not have a father around to teach them one. We called it the Gloria Briggs Trade and Skills Center because that was what it was, and that was whose name it carried. My wife, Gloria, had wanted to be a carpenter when she was a girl. Her father told her that was not a direction for young women in Memphis in 1969. She became a schoolteacher instead and was extraordinary at it. But she always kept a small toolbox under the bed. I saw that toolbox every day for 31 years. Dolores parked on the street. The lights were still on inside. I raised an eyebrow at her. She shrugged. I may have made a phone call, she said. When you call me, I made a call. Dolores. She turned and looked at me with that look she has been perfecting for decades. The look that says I have made a decision, and I need you to understand that the decision was already correct before you have your feelings about it. Walter, she said, you built that place. You built 3 of those places. You have been building things for this city for 20 years without telling a single soul who is doing it, and tonight of all nights you are not going to do it quietly. I looked at the building. The sign above the door was plain white letters on dark blue. Gloria Briggs Trade and Skills Center. EST 2003. I had driven Marcus past this building. More than once. He had never asked about the name. A man who does not ask about his own mother's name on a building is a man who has learned not to look too carefully at the things around him. I'd spent a long time wondering if that was my fault. Tonight, I was going to find out. Dolores helped me to the door. Not because I needed it entirely, but because she was Dolores, and helping people was her first language, and refusing help was, in her opinion, just bad manners dressed up as independence. The door opened, and I will not pretend I was ready for what was inside. There were people, not a handful of people, 40, 50 people. Some I knew. Clarence from a Tuesday night welding class who had gotten his certification last spring. The 2 young women from the Saturday morning electrical program. Reverend Okafor from the church 2 blocks over who had sent me 17 young men over the years and never once made it a public act. Teachers, parents, former students, people whose names I had learned slowly over 2 decades of showing up. And they were all there on a Tuesday night in an ice storm because Dolores had made a phone call, and a phone call had become a chain that none of them were willing to break. The room went quiet when I walked in. The good quiet. The kind of room gets when the thing it has been waiting for finally shows up. Somebody started clapping. I do not do well with being clapped at. I held up my hand. I said, I appreciate every single one of you, and I need all of you to understand that if Dolores called you out in this, whether she owes you gas money, and that is between you and her. Laughter. Real laughter. The kind that makes a cold room warm. They sat me down near the back where the good chairs were. Someone brought coffee. Strong coffee. The kind that has an opinion. Dolores sat across from me, with her phone face down on the table the way she does when she is about to say something that deserves full attention. She said, I called your attorney too. I looked at her. She looked back. Filed 3 weeks ago, Walter. I know. I watched it. She paused. And I may have told one of the news stations what was happening on Summer Avenue tonight. Dolores. She folded her hands on the table. There's a camera crew outside. She said it the same way she had once told me during Gloria's illness that the doctor had called. Steady. Honest. Not sorry. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the building that carried my wife's name. The ceiling I had helped re-roof in 2017 when the hail damage got bad. The skylights I had insisted on because I believed that people learning to work with their hands deserve to do it in natural light. Somewhere on the other side of Memphis in a house on a street I had helped pay for, a television was probably on. I thought about Renee watching the 11 o'clock news. I thought about what a facility brochure feels like in your hands when the world has just reorganized itself. I did not feel triumphant about that. I felt tired. I felt old. And somewhere underneath both of those things, I felt something quiet and warm that I eventually recognized as peace. Dolores said Marcus was on his way. She had called him after she called the news station, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities, and I respected every single one of them. She had told him I had been found disoriented on a sidewalk in the ice storm and that he needed to come to Summer Avenue immediately. She told me with a completely straight face, left out several other details. Most of them, I said. She nodded. I had a feeling, she said, he needed to see the building before he heard the explanation. I thought about that. She was right. She usually was. While we waited, I sat in that back room, and I thought about Gloria. She came into my life at a church picnic in 1974. She was wearing a yellow blouse and arguing with her cousin about whether cornbread counted as a side dish or a staple, and she had strong opinions that she was not moderating for anyone. I fell in love with her in approximately 4 minutes. We were married for 31 years. She died of a stroke in the spring of 2002, 3 weeks after her 54th birthday, while I was at work. I got the call at a job site. I drove to the hospital with concrete dust still on my hands. I never forgot that feeling. The feeling of arriving too late with your hands still dirty from the thing you were doing when the most important thing happened. The Gloria Briggs Trade and Skill Center was my answer to that feeling. I could not go back and be there. I could not undo anything. What I could do was take every dollar my father had left me and every dollar I earned after she was gone and build something she would have loved. Something that taught people what she had always believed, that a person who knows how to make a thing with their hands is never truly without options. I did it quietly because it was hers. It was not a thing for me to take credit for. I was just the one she left behind to do it. I heard the front door of the building open. I heard the crowd in the main room shift. Not loud. That particular kind of going still a group of people does when someone walks in who changes the atmosphere. I heard footsteps on the concrete floor. Fast steps. Marcus always walked fast when he was scared. When he was worried, he walked slow and deliberate like he was solving something. Fast meant he was scared of what he was going to find. I had listened to that boy's footsteps for 45 years, and I knew every version of them. The office door opened. Marcus is 6'1", which he got from my side, and he has a way of filling a doorway, which he also got from my side. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds with the expression of a man who had prepared an apology the whole drive over. And then his eyes moved past me to the framed photograph on the wall. A large photograph. Professional. Gloria, in the workshop, taken the day she came to see the building for the first time after the renovation. She had her hands on her hips, her head tilted back, laughing at something I'd said off camera. She was wearing a yellow blouse. I had asked the photographer specifically to come on the day I knew she was wearing yellow. The apology evaporated. I watched it leave his face in real time. His mouth opened. His hand went to the doorframe. "Dad," he said it like the word had just arrived from a long distance. "Sit down, Marcus," I said quietly. He did not sit. He stepped forward slowly. His eyes moved from the photograph to me, to the photograph to the sign on the wall that I had not told him about. The brass plaque beside the door that read, Gloria Marie Briggs. She believed a skilled hand changes a life. Built in her name. In her honor. Forever. "That is Mom," he said. He said it the way a person says something they already know, but need to hear out loud before it can be real. "It is," I said. "How long?" he said. "The center opened in 2003, I said. He did the math out loud. "That is 22 years, Dad." "Yes," I said. His jaw moved. 22 years, and you never told me. I waited a moment before answering. I said, "Marcus, you were with Renee by 2005. And Renee has a way of making everything about inheritance." He did not argue that. He looked at the photograph again, at his mother's laugh, at the yellow blouse. He pressed his fingers to his mouth and stood very still for a long moment, and I let him have it. Some realizations need to be stood inside before they can be carried. He turned around. "Dad, what is all this?" I told him. I started with the tax sale in 2001. I told him about the warehouse, the renovation, the certification programs. The 47 young people who had gotten journeyman's licenses through this building. The second building on Jackson Avenue. The third building in South Memphis that was still in the early phase. I told him about my attorney and the trust one had set up in Gloria's name the year after she died. I told him that not $1 had ever gone to me personally. Not $1. Not once. I watched his face do the math on 22 years of things he had never known. He sat down slowly, the way a man sits when the room is tilting. His elbows went to his knees. He rubbed his face. I let the silence do its work. Outside the office door, I could hear the building. The voices of people who had known this place and known me for 20 years. People who had watched it grow. People who had brought their children here and then, years later, brought their grandchildren. Dolores's voice somewhere in the back, steady and sure, answering a question from the reporter. I could hear the words she used. 22 years, she said. In secret. All of it. Every brick. Why did you keep it secret? Marcus said finally. He looked up. His eyes were red. Why not tell me? I wanted to think carefully about the answer I gave him, because I had thought about it for a long time. Not recently. I had thought about it for 22 years, and I had a clear answer. I said, because it was never about me. It was about your mother. It was about the things she wanted and never got to do. And the minute I told you, Marcus, it would have become a conversation about money, about the estate, about what was owed. And your mother never once in 31 years made anything about what was owed to her. I was not going to do that to her name. He put his face in his hands again. I let him. Outside, through the office's interior window, I could see the main workshop, the tool stations, the safety posters, the framed certificates on the wall from every student who had passed their licensing exam. There were 61 of them now. I had counted recently. 61 people who had changed their financial lives inside a building that carried Gloria's name. And every single one of them knew whose name it was. Every single one of them had been told the story of a woman who wanted to learn carpentry and was told no, and of the man who spent 22 years saying yes for her. They all knew. My own son did not. Dad, he said. His voice had changed. The scared was gone. Something that had not been in his voice in a very long time had moved in. Something that sounded like the boy he used to be before life, and Renee, and all of the daily noise of adulthood covered it over. He said, I am sorry. Not decorated. No qualifications around it. No but following it. Just I am sorry. I said, tell me what you were sorry for. He thought about that seriously. He said, I stood there in that living room, and I let her say what she said. I did not stop her. I should have stopped her. I did not stop her, because stopping her is harder than letting it happen, and I have been letting it happen for a long time. He looked at the photograph. I am sorry for that. I said, that is the right answer, Marcus. He nodded slowly. I said, now let me show you the rest of it. I stood up. My shoulders said a few words about that, but I ignored them. I opened the office door, and I walked him through that building the way I had walked through it 1,000 times before, but this time with my son beside me. I showed him the welding stations and the electrical tables and the woodworking area in the back, where on Saturday mornings a group of young women came in at 7 a.m. and built things. I showed him the back wall, where I had put up photographs of every student who had passed their certification, 61 frames, and a space for more. He stopped at one photograph near the corner. A young man, early 20s, holding up a journeyman plumber's license. Broad smile. Work boots. His hands still faintly marked from the training. He squinted at it. That is Darius, Marcus said slowly. That is Darius from my high school. He turned to look at me. He went to school here? Not school, I said. Certification program. 18 months. He came in knowing nothing and left with a license and a starting wage of $22 an hour. Marcus stared at the photograph. He goes to our church, Dad. I know, I said. He comes to the volunteer days in the spring. He turned and looked at me with the expression of a man revising a very long document. How many people in my life have come through here? I thought about it honestly. At least a dozen I know, personally. He made a sound. Half exhale, half something I had not heard from him since he was young. He looked like a man standing in a house he had walked past for 20 years and was only now looking at clearly. He said, she called you a useless burden. I let that sit. I said, yes, she did. He said, well, you were doing this. I said, well, I was doing this. He walked to the back of the workshop and stood there with his back to me for a long moment. His shoulders were tight. Then they dropped slowly, the way tension releases when a person stops trying to hold a position they have already lost. He turned around. He said, "What happens now, Dad?" And here is where I want you to pay attention, because this is the part where a lot of men in my position might make it small. Might say, "Come home, son, we'll work it out." Might accept a soft apology and let the whole thing settle back into the way things were. I'm not that kind of man. I walked back to the office. I sat back down in my chair. I reached into my duffel bag, the one I had packed 15 years ago and refreshed twice since. The one that had my medications, my important documents, my attorney's card, and a photograph of Gloria in a yellow blouse that I kept folded in the inside pocket of every bag I had ever owned since 2002. I set a large envelope on the table between us. Thick, rubber-banded. My attorney's letterhead in the return corner. Marcus looked at it. He looked at me. I said, "That is my updated estate plan. Signed and notarized 6 weeks ago." He said, "Dad." I said, "Let me finish. The house on Clearwater Drive. The one I bought in 1988. The one I paid off in 2001. The one I signed over to you 11 years ago when you got married." Marcus. I watched him. That house has been retitled back into the Gloria Briggs Foundation. He went very still. "It will become transitional housing," I said, "for young people completing the certification programs who need a stable address while they're getting established." The color left his face in a long, slow wave. "Dad, Renee called me a burden," I said. "I am making sure the house carries one. For about 30 families who genuinely need the weight of it." He leaned back. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the photograph of his mother on the wall. He looked at me. He said, "Does Renee know?" I said, "My attorney sent the paperwork to the house this afternoon." He closed his eyes briefly. I said, "By now she has seen the news. By now her mother has called. Her friends have called. Every person she has ever told the story of her difficult father-in-law to has called." He nodded very slowly. I said, "Marcus." He opened his eyes. "You have a decision to make. You have always had this decision to make, and you have been postponing it. I am 60 days out of that house, and 60 days is how long you have." He looked at me. "What decision?" he said. "Whether you are her husband or my son," I said. "I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to decide who you actually are. Because a man who stands in a kitchen and says nothing while his wife dismantles his father is not a version of you that I am going to build my next chapter around." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." 2 words. Short. "True." I said, "Your mother would have been furious tonight." He looked at the photograph. He said, "She would have been." He was quiet again. Then, "She would have also found a way to make it funny somehow." Eventually, he almost smiled. That almost smile broke something open in the room. I said, "Yes, she would have. She would have made a joke about something, and you would have laughed, and then she would have cried a little bit in the kitchen where she thought nobody could see her, and then the next morning she would have made everyone pancakes like nothing happened." He laughed. One real laugh. Short. It echoed in that workshop and sounded exactly like him at 9 years old. Dolores appeared in the office doorway. She looked at me, then at Marcus, then at the envelope on the table. She had the look of a woman who had seen exactly what she expected to see and was choosing not to say "I told you." So only because she was a professional. She said, "There's a reporter who would very much like 5 minutes with you, Walter." I said, "Tell her 3 minutes. It is late and I have a bad shoulder." Dolores said, I said, "Tell him 3 minutes." Dolores nodded and pulled the door half closed. Marcus looked at me. "Are you going to talk to the cameras?" I said, "I'm 72 years old, Marcus. I was thrown out into an ice storm an hour and a half ago. The least I can do is be correctly quoted about it." Marcus stood up. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned back around. He said, "Can I come back?" "Not to the house. Here, to this place. I want to understand it." I looked at my son. I thought about Gloria. I thought about the 40 years that had led to this room. I said, "You can come back. The Tuesday night class starts at 6. Bring your work boots." "You do not have any," I said before he could answer. "We'll get you some." He nodded. He looked one more time at his mother's photograph. That laugh. The yellow blouse. The hands on her hips. He said, "She looks happy." She was, I said. Most of the time she was. He left the office first, and I gave him a moment before I followed. The main room had gone quieter, so people had gone home. The ones who stayed were the ones who always stayed. Clarence in the back corner, Reverend Okafor near the door, the two women from the Saturday program talking quietly by the tool stations, Dolores near the front with the reporter, a young woman who had the look of someone who had come for a routine local interest piece and had ended up with something considerably larger. I walked toward her slowly, my shoulder making its opinions known. My old gray jacket still on because the building held the cold and nobody had gotten around to turning the heat all the way up. She held out her hand. "Mr. Briggs?" I shook it. She said, "I understand you founded this center." I said, "My wife founded it. She just needed someone to build it for her." She looked at me. She said, "And your son? He did not know?" I said, "He knows now." She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about that. I said, "It feels like being 72 years old on a Tuesday night in January with a bad shoulder and a cup of coffee that has gone cold, standing in a building that is going to outlive every opinion anyone ever had about me." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Can I quote you on that?" I said, "That is the whole reason I am standing here." She asked her questions. I answered them the way I answer everything, directly, without decoration. I told her about the tax sale, about Gloria's toolbox, about the 47 journeyman certifications and the 61 framed licenses on the wall, about the second building on Jackson and the third one coming. I told her about the trust and how not $1 had ever touched my personal accounts. She took notes. The camera behind her rolled the whole time, and I knew what was happening 14 miles away in a house on Clearwater Drive. I knew because I had been patient for a long time, and patience eventually has a very loud ending. Renee was watching the 11 o'clock news. She was watching it on the television in the living room. My living room. The one she said I had taken over. The one she had made me feel like a guest in for 14 months. And the 11 o'clock news was introducing her to the man she had called a useless burden. Walter Eugene Briggs, 72 years old, founder of the Gloria Briggs Trade and Skills Center. 3 locations, 22 years, 47 journeyman certifications, 61 licensed tradespeople, and the Clearwater Drive house, which as of 6 weeks ago belonged not to her, but to the foundation that would house 30 families who needed it more than she needed a guest room to resent. I did not feel good about imagining her face. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a man who collects other people's bad moments. But I'm also 72 years old with a bad shoulder and concrete dust in my memory and 31 years of loving a woman I could not save. And if I'm being truthful, I felt something that was not satisfaction. I felt this specific kind of peace that comes when a thing that has been waiting a very long time finally arrives. Gloria used to say patience is not the same as silence. I had been silent. I had never once been patient. I had been building. Marcus came to stand beside me near the end of the interview. He did not say anything. He stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him the way you feel a person's warmth when they're finally standing where they're supposed to be standing. The reporter finished. The camera clicked off. The room began to slowly, warmly empty out into the Memphis night. Clarence shook my hand and said, "Mr. Briggs, I will see you Tuesday." I said, "I will be here." Reverend Okafor put his hand on my shoulder, the good one, and said nothing because he is a man who understands that some moments do not need a sermon on top of them. Dolores reappeared with my cold coffee and a look that said she had reorganized the next 2 weeks of my life and I would be receiving the itinerary in the morning. She said, "You will stay at my place tonight." I said, "Dolores." She said, "I have a guest room with a good window that catches the morning sun." I stared at her. She looked back at me. "Walter Eugene Briggs," she said, "I have been your wife's best friend for 50 years and your friend for 22. Get in the car." I looked at Marcus. He said, "She's right, Dad. Go. I will call you in the morning." I said, "Yes, you will." I turned back to Dolores. She handed me my cold coffee. I drank it. It tasted like the end of something and the beginning of something else, and like the kind of thing you can only fully taste if you have been carrying it for a very long time. We walked to the door. I stopped once and looked back at the main workshop, the tool stations, the safety posters, the 61 framed certificates, the photograph on the wall. Gloria in the yellow blouse, hands on hips, head back, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. It did not matter what I had said. It only mattered that she was laughing. I said, "Good night, Gloria." I said it quietly, not for the room, just for her. Then I walked out into the Memphis ice storm, Dolores on my left, my duffel bag on my shoulder, my gray jacket doing what gray jackets do. Behind us, through the tall front windows of the building, I could see the last few people gathering their coats. The photographs on the wall, the light on the ceiling that I had insisted be natural where possible. And I thought about what it means to build something in silence. Not because you are ashamed of it, not because you are afraid, but because some things, if you speak them too soon, become about the speaking. And some things deserve to be about the thing itself. 22 years, 3 buildings, 61 licenses, 1 photograph, 1 yellow blouse, 1 woman who wanted to build things and was told no, and 1 man who spent the rest of his life building them for her. That was the story. That was always the whole story. Everything else, Renee's brochures, Marcus's silence, the ice storm, the camera, the 11 o'clock news, all of it was just the night the story finally decided to stop being quiet. Dolores opened the passenger door of her white Buick and stood there the way she stands when she is being patient with the speed at which I do things. I got in. She got in. She turned the heat all the way up without being asked. She pulled out onto Summer Avenue. We drove in silence for 2 blocks. Then she said, "You know what Gloria would say right now?" I said, "She would say something entirely inappropriate for a woman of her faith, and then laugh about it, and make everyone else laugh too." Dolores said, "She would say, 'Walter, I cannot believe it took you 72 years to stop being the only person in the room who did not know you were remarkable.'" I looked out the window at the ice on the Memphis streets. I said, "She would have been right." Dolores said, "She was always right." I said, "Almost always." She almost always was. We drove through Berkeley, through Raleigh, through the quiet Memphis dark with all its ice and its Christmas lights and its sleeping families. I thought about Marcus. I thought about Tuesday. I thought about him in work boots he did not own, yet standing at a welding station, learning to build something for the first time at 45 years old. I thought about whether it was too late for that. I decided it was not. I have never believed it is too late for a person to learn to build something. That is the whole point of the building. That is what it is there for. Dolores said, "The attorney will call in the morning about the Clearwater house." I said, "I know." She said, "Renee has 60 days." I said, "I know." She said, "Marcus needs to decide in 60 days." I said, "He already knows what he needs to decide." Dolores nodded. She said, "And you? What do you need?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "I need a good window that catches the morning sun and a strong cup of coffee and enough time to watch 62 framed licenses go up on that wall." She said, 62? I said, "There is a young woman who starts the electrical program in March. She is going to pass on the first try. I can tell." Dolores smiled. She did not say anything about that. She just drove. We crossed over Poplar, and I looked out at the Memphis skyline, such as it is, and I thought about being 72 years old on a Tuesday night in January with a bad shoulder and a cold cup of coffee in a building that carried my wife's name. And I thought, this is not the worst thing that has ever happened to me. This is not even close to the worst thing. The worst thing happened in the spring of 2002 with concrete dust on my hands and a phone call I was not ready for. Everything since then has been the answer to that phone call. Everything since then has been me showing up. We pulled up to Dolores's house on Lindale. A neat brick house. Small rose bushes along the walk, tucked in and pruned for the winter. She had put lights up along the porch railing. Blue lights. She said Gloria liked blue lights. She said it quietly. I said she did. We sat in the car for a moment. Neither of us moved. Then Dolores said, "Do you think he's going to be all right?" She meant Marcus. I thought about my son. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep watching baseball with me on Friday nights and pretend in the morning that he had been awake the whole time. I thought about the man who had stood in a living room and said nothing. I said, "He's going to have to decide to be all right. That is different from just being all right." She nodded. I said, "But he stood next to me at the end tonight. He stood there without being asked. That is something." She said, "That is something." I got out of the car. The cold air came back, but it was a different cold now. Not hostile, just weather. Just the world being itself in January. I stood on the walk for a moment and looked up at the Memphis sky through the bare branches of the trees. Stars. Faint. The ice making everything sharp and clear in a way that warm weather never does. I thought about Gloria. Not the last months. Not the hospital. Before all of that. The third date we ever had. A Thursday night. She had worn the yellow blouse for the first time, and she did not know I noticed, and I never told her I had noticed until our 15th anniversary when I said, "I've been in love with you since the yellow blouse." And she hit me with a dish towel and said, "Walter, you have never once in your life led with the right information." She was right about that, too. I walked up to Dolores's door. The blue lights were warm. Behind me across the city of Memphis in a house that would soon be carrying 30 families instead of one woman's resentment, a television was still on. And a man named Marcus Briggs was sitting on a couch in his living room looking at his phone, which had 17 missed calls, and making a very specific decision about who he was going to be. I had not told him what to choose. I had only showed him what was possible when you choose correctly. The rest was his. It always had been. Some lessons arrive at exactly the right time. Others arrive at 72 in an ice storm. The door opened before I could knock. Dolores. She had already put on the kettle. She handed me a towel from my shoulder and pointed to the guest room at the end of the hall. "Good window," she said. "Morning light." "I know," I said. She said, "Gloria told me about this room when I was thinking about buying the house. She said you would need it someday." I stood in the hallway with a towel and a duffel bag and 22 years of silence sitting lightly on me for the first time in a long time. I said, "She knew me better than I knew myself." Dolores said, "Most good women do." I went to the guest room. I set my bag down. I sat on the edge of the bed. The window was right there, dark now, but pointed exactly east. In the morning, the light would come straight through it. I thought, "Gloria Marie Briggs, I built the thing you wanted. I built it in your name and in silence, and I will keep building it until these hands give out." And tonight your son finally saw it. I thought that was enough. I thought that was exactly enough. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button and subscribe to Daddy's Revenge. We are here every week with stories that are real, raw, and built the way good things always are. In love, in silence, and forever.